Welcome back to Deep Thoughts, ladies and gentlemen. So this is going to be a tough episode for me to put together personally, so hopefully it comes out smooth and looks like I did everything right. Imagine for a second that everything you've ever been told about radiation, nuclear bombs, atomic bombs, the whole scare of that whole thing, although not to be completely overlooked, but a lot of the residual effects of this industry, nuclear power plants, isotopes in general, situations like 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, Fukushima, that they're not exactly as dire as they make them sound. I know that a lot of you have done research and you've seen those documentaries, especially on Chernobyl, where the grass is really green. Now, there are some red trees there. What I want to do is create a sort of a montage video of subjects related to one Galen Winsor, a gentleman in 1985 who recorded pretty much a 3-segment video with another dude covering a lot of this. And he just did, he did a personal presentation, then an interview, then a personal presentation. It totaled about an hour and 31 minutes. It's Winsor, not like the royal family. Galen is Galen, just in case you're interested. If you can't find it on YouTube, which would mean they've taken it down, which I doubt, you can probably find it on Rumble. It's a long watch. And there are tons of details. And the stickler I'm going to have with trying to put all this together is that there are several technologies in play for any one location of a particular solution, be it for a bomb, be it for a power plant, and other uses to create power. So it's going to be a little tricky. I'll probably flub a few things and mix things up, but I'm going to do my best to make sure that we don't mention the wrong technology for the wrong thing. Because, again, the bomb for Hiroshima was different than the bomb for Nagasaki. Totally two different technologies, and it's different than what ended up being what we have for the power plants themselves. Now, this is an episode. I do have a few notes here. I took a bunch of notes on Galen a long time ago. Then I came back to it, and I was like, what the hell is this? Nothing made any sense. But let's just talk about the base principles of where we're going here. We are now in a situation in the world where they are going to be probably engaging in some form of war using this technology. And because the banks really want to get their little playground back, to launder money, to develop weapons that will hurt us, and just to do whatever the heck they want there. All the negative stuff that is the creepiest, weirdest stuff that mankind at their level, which is like demon kind, does in this planet. So they're already building up the narrative, right, that this is going to happen, that they're going to use these controlled nuclear weapons over there, and, who knows, boy, they could drop on Europe, they could blow up in any major city in America, and just better wait to see if they do one of those little FF things. So what I want you to do, and the value of this episode, is to consider for a second that maybe a lot of what they told you to protect yourself and recover from these situations is a lot more fundamental than they described. And then I want to remind you, and what's sad is people haven't seen this movie. Steven Spielberg's first giant film after Jaws was Close Encounters of the Third Kind. In this movie, you have several people, mainly Richard Dreyfuss and this other woman, chasing UFO sightings and trying to figure out what's going on because they seem to be getting a lot more prevalent. He keeps dreaming of this mountain sort of thing, and she keeps drawing this mountain sort of thing at her house, but they haven't both met each other yet. Eventually, Richard Dreyfuss builds this thing in his living room and loses his wife and his kids because he finally realizes, in engaging in a smaller model in clay at his train station he built for his kids, that when he tried to take it down, he pulled the top off and boom, he had Devil's Tower. And as soon as he saw Devil's Tower, which is an old dormant volcano, not a tree, he was like, oh my God, this is it. This is the location. I got to get there. She was drawing this in charcoal paintings or charcoal drawings in her house. They end up going to Devil's Tower because the big event's going to happen there. The military also deciphered the song, the chimes, dum, 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 dum. And that was actually a GPS coordinate that ended up being Devil's Tower. Not really. I mean, there was other chirpy things that were going on. So the military needed to get rid of all of the people around Devil's Tower so they could have this huge engagement with whatever the hell was going to show up without anybody seeing. So in that movie of Close Encounters of the Third Kind, I'm not mentioning anything related to today, they created a fake toxic spill that, you were given these pigeons or these doves in cages. And that's, as long as your dove was alive, you weren't in a toxic area. But of course, if they found you, they'd take the dove around the corner and it would die. And they'd say, see, you need to get out of here, right? So Dreyfus and this woman finally get together. They drive the station wagon there. And eventually Dreyfus figures out this is all bullshit. This toxic thing is all crap. He takes his mask off inside this helicopter when they're just about to be flown out. And he goes, the air is fine. Let's get out of here. And him, the chick, and this other dude jump out of the helicopter, start hauling ass, and the military tries to chase them, but the terrain is so bad that they get away. But then these helicopters come and try to spray them with some nerve gas or some sleepy gas. Sorry, not nerve gas. And the straggler guy gets nailed. He falls asleep, and he and the chick get around the corner, and they see the mothership land, man. Why mention that? Seems unrelated. Well, imagine that you and I both, without this information, we might be believing stockpiles of crap. Stockpiles of crap about the lethality of some of this technology. And there's some interesting things about this. I even discovered some stuff I didn't know about this stuff, and I have dug into this my whole life. I mean, seriously, we won't start off with it, but we'll eventually get to 3 Mile Island and the fact that Galen Winsor really revealed this as a FF situation. False is one of those words. Well, it's easy to drop. They asked him if 3 Mile Island was real. This critical situation that was going on. That was turned into a movie called China Syndrome, which is literally responsible for me getting involved in subatomic physics at the age of 9. I saw this movie, scared the shit out of me. I didn't know what I was watching. I didn't know what was real and what was fake, and no one else did either. Galen Winsor reminds the guy who's interviewing him, hey, you know what? They wrote a report at 3 Mile Island 365 days to the day before this event occurs that exact event is probably possible at that location. And the dude went, oh, I got it. He says they purposely created this crisis to scare the crap out of people, to catalyze the narrative, so when the movie came out, it's right there on target. Remember Michael Bay came out with this weird movie in 2020? He had it in the fucking can, and it was exactly the situation that we were in, including all of the restrictions advanced like 10 years. All right. So the irony of it all is just crazy for me, because I grabbed the encyclopedia and I started going through this. I'm going to create a reactor that doesn't go critical. I was probably overcompensating, to be honest. But there are different technologies that do different things, okay? Now, one of the big questions out there is, what's the difference between an atomic bomb going off in an area and people being able to live there a lot sooner than, say, Chernobyl, say, Fukushima? Chernobyl is still worse than Fukushima, apparently. It all comes down to the payload of what created these experiences in the first place. Now, I wrote some notes down. I just realized did not transfer, but it was all the statistical background behind how many pounds of materials were actually used. But they put together a bomb, the little boy bomb, for Hiroshima. Okay, that's the big one that is on target, and it's the one that probably vaporized about 80,000 people. The danger of the bomb is the vapor thermalization of this reaction, killing people down below. burning them alive, leaving them so maimed that they die eventually. Not the radioactivity. Nagasaki was a completely different bomb using your first plutonium core with the uranium ball around the outside being compressed by explosives. And that was Fat Man. That was named after the character in the Maltese Falcon, apparently. It's like weird, right? But that had a lot more material in it. I'm thinking, I can't remember the Hiroshima poundage, but it's just, it's like tens of pounds for Hiroshima. And so what ends up happening is when it explodes, it's distributing that material around the land in a very minute way. Now, the thing you have to understand, and again, if you are on board with my episodes on ether, this will actually be much easier for you to understand than other folks to understand, because you're going to physically see the model inside your head, like instantaneously. Before we go on back to Nagasaki, because this will all click in your head. When you have a more radioactive material, well, what is that? I mean, just as a basic principle of explanation, what is it? You have some atomic matter which is emitting all kinds of energy. From gamma radiation to beta radiation, it is emitting its core. Well, if you just think about it as ether, you are actually unraveling what it's made out of. The more radioactive a material is, the faster it will unravel. It's just like if you had a log that's a normal log, and you light it on fire, it's going to last a certain amount of time. When you have a Duraflame log and you put kerosene on top of it and other sort of propellants on it, well, that log's not going to last that long because it's going to burn up really fast. Those logs are supposed to catalyze the fire in your fireplace for real wood. Although, by the 90s, people were just putting Duraflames in their fireplace, right? So every time you hear about a super radioactive material, you can immediately start telling yourself, okay, this stuff is going to unravel itself potentially in weeks. They said that at Fukushima's core of what, and again, there's a bunch of speculation as to whether or not these official stories actually took place. Let's just go with the official story so we can learn something here. And I'm with you on the alternate ones, because I listened to the German engineers talk about how they had completely deactivated reactor 4 and then watched it explode on TV, and they're like, how the hell is that possible, right? Meaning no rods were in the building. No rods were on the roof. They took them out. But anyway, back to the official story. There's an eruption. There's problems. Cores are burning through their containers down into the ground. Not that far. They're creating sort of their own Fukushima elephant foot, which is in Chernobyl, which we'll get to. But they said that because of the type of emissions that went out and basically burst with steam, because that's what you normally get when you get a reactor going bad. You get just a steam explosion. You get a heat explosion. It's what is traveling in this explosion that's really important. With Chernobyl, you had 10 tons of radioactive material eject into the sky. 10 tons out of 200 tons. Huge. Okay? 5% of it went out the window. And that's what they're willing to tell us. It might have been more. But then again, Chernobyl's lush as could be right now. But they said that even the official story of Chernobyl was that after 2 weeks of just allowing this stuff, this is what Galen Winsor is going to tell us, to just sit out and unravel and mix with the oxygen. It's going from a lethal emission, meaning if you're really close to it, will physically can damage your body. But the further you get away from it, it's an exponential of 10. So you get really, really close to it, you could start feeling warmth in your hand and start getting lesions and cuts and, dead skin and things, because it's just literally shredding what you are. But if you stand 10 feet over, you can't even feel it and you're not at lethal levels anymore. Sometimes these materials could be shielded with a piece of paper. Even though without the piece of paper, it's not good for you. It's that delicate. Other materials can be so intense, although they won't last that long, they can go right through, heavier materials and really cause you a lot of damage. The two best insulators I know of is lead and cement. A third might be water itself. So with Hiroshima, you have a lot less materials creating that explosion, which should be terrifying because it didn't take that much to create a tremendous amount of carnage. With Nagasaki, there was bad weather. They did drop it. It did kill people. But then the physicists that put it together look at the yield and sort of the fuzzy magic and mathematics that go around this. What's fascinating about the research that I completed today is I read probably, without question, a dozen well-written articles about the lethality of various sources of radiation that we end up using in this world, from the power plants to the bombs. And, you have to sift out, obviously, someone just cutting and pasting sort of Wikipedia stuff into the article. Not that all that's incorrect or anything, but the lethality of it. And then you get to very well-written articles where you actually have someone saying, well, a lot of this mathematics is very theoretical still, because the chemistry at the subatomic level is so specific and so delicate, because the shape and the size of whatever fuel you're using, whatever registry of uranium you might be using, or something else like plutonium, at least the above ground disclosed technology and understanding of this is still very elusive, meaning we can't get levels of precision with this without being on site and making sure that everything that we're doing is extremely controlled at a particular reactor of some sort, at a particular bomb manufacturing of some sort. It's just good to note that, because this solid footing that you want to be on when you talk about these very volatile, pardon the pun, subjects of how safe we're going to be and how dangerous this is, we have to weigh it with what seems to be the most informed people on planet Earth are saying. I found that the people that sounded the most informed and wrote articles that seemed to cover all four corners of a particular subject yielded to, hey, we don't exactly know, depending on what you're dealing with, how lethal this stuff is. So Galen Winsor was a dude that worked on the Manhattan Project in Hanford, Oak Ridge National Laboratories, and nuclear plant in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and worked for General Electric's Midwest Fuel Recovery Plant in Morris, Illinois, General Electric's Fuel Fabrication Facility in San Jose, California, and Wilmington, North Carolina. And he's worked in every major decommissioning project around the nation up to the present time, which was 1985. So Galen's big thing is very, very simple in terms of formula. Now, he has a lot of specifics about various materials that he worked with that didn't seem to cause him any problems. He was coming from a very specific angle and not coming from other angles, which is where people get a little bit confused with, hey, it seems like it's no problem. I think overall, if you're involved in a situation where there is some sort of nuclear attack and there is some sort of radiation fallout, it's almost like the 3-second rule, right? Where you drop something on the ground and you can pick it back up and eat it, and there's the 3-second rule. All right. Ours is probably 2 to 4 week issue, which is that materials are going to come down. Again, if the more radioactive it is, the more it's going to actually cause huge issues. And we would have to find out what on earth that blew up. What was it made out of to understand how lethal it is outside? Now, usually in most cases, there's an effort to scoop that stuff up and put it in a location to let it air out. According to Galen Winsor, most radiation, because it is emitting something, it's destroying itself. That's what that means, right? Now, there's something called half-life. Now, the thing I learned today about half-lives that I had never been told before, because it was in the guise of getting rid of this material in terms of allowing it to either naturally diffuse itself out of existence to a non-lethal level or putting it somewhere where it could do that. He vouched for plutonium all the way down to uranium-222, and which I would say is, I consider plutonium, 238 is more intense than 222 in some cases, depending on how it's fabricated, right? But he said that just exposing this material to the oxygen of the atmosphere is the best way to get it to unravel itself in a non-lethal way. Obviously, towers, help it emit and diffuse higher up in the atmosphere so that down below we're not getting exposed. So there's reasons for that. There are methods of using pools of water to get it to emit into the water, which is a good shield to itself. And again, once it's unraveled itself, it no longer is what it is. And immediately beyond that proximity, according to everything I read today and over the last 6 months on this whole thing, preparing for this episode, you no longer have a lethality to it. It would be almost like a smell. You get close to something, it smells pretty bad. It's on the ground. Well, you walk 10 feet away, I can still smell it. But you walk 100 feet away, you can't smell it anymore. It has no effect on you whatsoever. Now, with radioactive materials, because this is so subatomic, you have to understand that 1 inch off of a emitting piece of radiation or radioactive materials, it's an eternity of distance. It'd be like traveling to the edge of our solar system. It's a big deal when you're talking about these little tiny things, like a neutron that's made of 3 quarks. This thing is so frickin' teeny that 1 inch is beyond probably more like halfway across our galaxy. It's a huge distance. And so when we give it credit for being able to unravel with such force that it's actually hurting flesh, that's a big unraveling situation, but you're going to have a lot of material there in order to create such an effect. So like a little snowflake of fallout is going to be very volatile at the beginning, but you give it a couple weeks and you do your best to kind of, move that stuff away from your house. If you got a house and it's just littered with this stuff, you wait a few weeks, hopefully it rains a little bit. It's going to be okay. But, we want it to be exposed to the air so it doesn't get next to other, I guess you could just say atomic material, dirt, whatever, cement, so the point where it's trying to emit itself apart, but it's actually being held together by neighboring materials. You want it fully exposed so there's no inertia against it, so it just goes poof and it just fizzles itself out. For those of you who know fireworks really well, you got a JJ and you got a flower, right? The flower is the big giant JJ. And you light those things, they go, boo, 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 and they bounce around, right? And then it's just a bummer when they end, they go, and the thing just rolls off down the curb, right? Think about that sort of verbal reaction when you are thinking about atomic emissions making itself inert to hurting the human body. Now, of course, again, it depends on the material. It depends on how much you've actually got in one location as to how long that process is going to take. But if an atomic bomb were to go off, for instance, you're talking about an amazing distribution of materials. And I'm saying that in a good way, that you're talking about, even though it's pushing this stuff everywhere, you're taking it and you're knocking it into its smallest pieces possible, plus a bunch of it's thermalizing in the bomb itself. So we're only talking about the unspent fuel that is actually being distributed around a particular epicenter, right? A ground zero. Give it some time. The soldiers that we had, where we blew these things up in the desert, and then we had soldiers walk straight to ground zero before we really understood what the hell we were doing. Some of them had issues. But you go a couple years, I think you're back in business, provided you don't have something very strange like a reactor vaporizing or at least emitting. That's the whole thing about Chernobyl, is you've got some tonnage that's vaporizing water and creating a thrust out this ceiling of this reactor. And apparently with Chernobyl, again, everything with a grain of salt, it was due to pure negligence of the workers who didn't want to engage in various maintenance activities because they were, I guess, dangerous or just time consuming or whatever. And they knew they were pushing the very envelope of the cooling systems to the point where it went critical It was 100% the employee's fault, apparently. I mean, how else could it be anything else that the employee's fault? God bless them. And you've got a bunch that's going to vaporize into nothing that's a threat. And then you have 5 tons or 10 tons of this stuff, 5% of it going out the door, barely atomized, right? It's just being knocked into pieces. And now you have all this very heavy materials all over the place that's going to take a long time to fizzle out because it's chunks of this stuff. Think about it, 10 tons? That's a tremendous amount, right? But again, there's lots of specials on Chernobyl where people are going down there, flying drones. Seems like the plant life is recovered. Again, there's a forest, which is called like Red Forest, I think, a red tree forest or something like that. The trees turning red is most likely, again, a finite event. This thing happened in 1985, right? So you have a finite event that is making the trees change their composition to the point they're more blood red. Now, fast forward 37 years, you no longer have necessarily that effect, okay? The one thing that Winsor, Galen Winsor, Ginsler, hey, it's a nice nickname for him, right? But Winsor, he came up with a bottle, 2 bottles actually, during one of his demonstrations. He held in his hand no dose, little tiny bottle. He said, any child with money can buy this bottle. And he goes, here is a particular isotope. I forgot exactly which one. It was a black dust. He says, none of you can get this material. Okay. He says, if you swallow one of these 2 bottles, it can kill you. In fact, it can kill 4 grown men your size. And he points at a pretty like 6-foot guy in the front row, excuse me. He says, you have a guess. And of course, he knows where he's playing us. He says, look, the no-dose caffeine can kill 4 people in this room. Which I didn't know that, but anyway. He goes, this stuff here is radioactive, and according to a Senate bill that was passed in 82, and this is the basis of his entire presentation, this dude worked in radioactive field for 35 years. In 1982, without consulting, in fact, by 1973, without consulting any of the experts, of which he was one of the top ones in the United States of America, plus his colleagues were the next 8 tiers down. No one talked to any of these guys, and they started getting people showing up to his plan he had designed and they had built in 1973 that was going to get rid of most of this waste, quote-unquote waste. He didn't really call it waste. He said, who did you talk to come up with these, safe levels of exposure to this material? We're the guys that know, and you're at ridiculously low levels, like 1,000th of the level that, would be just fine. You could go 1,000 times more than that, we'd just be fine. We're carrying around these bars. Galen Winsor said that at one point in his life, he was carrying 2.5 grams of plutonium in his left hand, 2.5 grams in his right hand. He just put them in his pockets and walked down the hallway, and he goes, it's just important that these 2 don't touch each other, because if you touch them together, you get 5 grams and you get a blue flash of heat that you will not survive. So he goes, I'd walk into a laboratory where I'm delivering these, and I'd hand him my left hand stuff, wait for that to get all wrapped up, and then I'd pull up my right hand one and put that in the other one, and we're just fine. Now, we will talk about the Demon Core as well. But yeah, in 1982, they made all this law. And his whole thing is about the fact that this energy industry, which we're going to get into, developed all of this cooties about things that emit radiation being super duper lethal. So he's talking in 1985, and he's a good old boy, man. He believes that, just telling the people is going to change the world. He lived to be 82 years old and died in 2008. But he's got this other bottle of this really radioactive stuff. So he's got a Geiger counter there. He puts it up to the bottom of the bottle. It's making a pretty good chatter. And he pops the top off and he puts it in the top of the bottle. Man, it's squawking like crazy. All that sound, right? And so then he pours some in his hand. And he shows it to you. And he goes, technically speaking, I'm already completely toxified in here. They'd have to actually bring in a hazmat team and get me all cleaned up. But he goes, I'm going to decontaminate myself now. He puts the Geiger counter to that stuff on his hand. It's just louder than hell. And he criticizes the Geiger counter because he goes, the Geiger counter is only really, at least in 85, he goes, this one's only picking up gamma radiation, which is basically heat. It's not lethal. It's just heat. So then he scoops up most of it in the bottle, puts the lid back on, puts it down. And then he goes, oh, but I still have this amount on my hand. He's got a black spot of dust in his hand. Just think of like black charcoal out of your barbecue, right? Says, let me clean up the rest of this. And he licks it off his hand. And he shows you his tongue, and it's black. And he puts the Geiger counter to his tongue, and it's squawking like crazy. And he puts his tongue in his mouth and swallows it all down. He says, I've been doing this presentation for, 20 years. I'm fine. He goes, but they've been trying to get this stuff out of my hand by raiding my house with SWAT teams and all kinds of stuff and sending me threatening letters and threatening phone calls that I'm not allowed to expose this. But now imagine, because he has a lot of angles we're going to go through. Let's stop for a big angle. You are the energy industry. The energy industry controls population growth, and they understand this. It also is the control mechanism over people. And it's also one of the most lucrative businesses on planet Earth. I don't know if it's more lucrative than oil, which it probably isn't. But oil is something you can ship around, right? It's much easier just to get oil in a barrel and ship it around, right? Electricity is going to go down a wire. If Wardenclyffe Tower was built, it would be broadcast in dielectric scalar pulses, right? So this material that Madame Curie discovers and is perfected both to be a bomb, both to be heavy ordnance, depleted uranium. This stuff creates heat, if nothing else. There are forms of these materials that actually shed electrons. I had someone argue with me that they're just beta particles, and it's like, well, the power plants inside of satellites are bars. They're basically wrapped with coils, and that's how supposedly, and again, I don't think these are really out there, but this is the theory for powering the 2 Voyagers that went out there. And a bunch of the other ones that are up there. Although once you get in the Van Allen belts, you got infinite electrons up there. So I don't know. Because the big thing was the Florida residents were saying, we don't want you to launch these satellites over our state, because if the rocket explodes and you've got nuclear material on there, we don't want it to be splattering down on us. And of course, they don't understand it's barely any material. And it would most likely come down in a solid bar, even if the whole thing exploded. But you suddenly realize, as an energy industry, it's a cinch. Get some of this material together, boil water, turn a turbine, you're good to go. Wow, all the other energy industries disappear. Why have hydroelectric? Why have coal? Why even get into geothermal? I mean, geothermal is the best sort of lowbrow technique. It's the top of the food chain of all power plant techniques, although they're built incorrectly most of the time. I've never known anyone to build one properly. They have open pipes into the ground, bringing up sulfuric acid, a bunch of other stuff when it should be a closed pipe. But whatever. That's a different episode. So the energy industry and this control apparatus, which you can hide underneath industry. And remember, industry is a lower level layer of our interaction with this capability. The layer above that doesn't really care about technically energy. They care about the control apparatus that's over us, that they're going to sell you a unit of power, and you're going to have to go earn that money and pay for the power. Now, of course, demanding that society get off their ass and do something is half of their formula, because when you don't, you have what we have today, which is a bunch of kids and adults that don't want to work. So there's some logic behind some of what they're saying. It's not all evil. But you have this power supply now that's just like dig it out of the ground, refine it, shape it, come up with a mathematical algorithm based on what you're using at the time, whatever isotope you're using, whatever radioactive material you're using. And now we have power. And you don't really need to charge for it. You don't. You're just being assholes controlling the world, right? Okay. You imagine this reaction's actually discovered in like 1938. Your first sort of power plants formed in 1942, and of course your first bomb is there's actually a name for the bomb that they used in the desert, like 44, 45, So you've got decades that pass. You got the rest of the 40s, all the 50s, all the 60s, and by 1973, approximately around 30 years later, they're coming down with these regulations, telling the experts of the world what's safe and what's not safe, without ever consulting any of them. They just picked a metric, emissions and said, well, let's just say that that is too much. All right. Now, Galen Winsor had a very interesting theory, and I have to go with what he's talking about here. One of his first theories, if I understand it properly, had to do with the fact that if this stuff was not lethal to transport, then it becomes possible for your enemy to steal it. If it is very toxic and, thought of as, instantaneously lethal in most forms, if not carefully transported in careful containers and all that kind of stuff, then your enemy is not likely to mess with it because it's going to be too dangerous to steal it. Very interesting. But when he started looking up the food chain of who was coming up with these crazy restrictions when he had just built the most sophisticated kind of reprocessing plant to get rid of this stuff, to destroy it and make it harmless by 1973, he started seeing it was just politicians. And then it was just corporate heads of these energy companies saying that this stuff was suddenly massively lethal. The stuff they used to carry in their hand without any repercussions, kick with their bare feet, all of a sudden is going to kill them. Would have killed them had they engaged in those same activities. One of the plants that he had built, this plant in 73, which he will show you in this video, is beautifully built, and it had a gigantic pool of water in it, where way down below, this material is being exposed to the water to do its dissipation. Okay. He said, look, I used to swim in this pool, 20 degrees outside. And he goes, I'd swim in this water and it's like 88 degrees. And he goes, not only did I swim in the water, but I drank the water, because when you swim, you do ingest the water because your mouth, your eyes, your ears, all your orifices, right, are going to take in this water. The guy lived to be 82. But according to all these standards that were being handed down by politicians and these energy corporations, which were competitors at the time, he would have died almost instantaneously. That night, he would have just rolled over and died. Okay? Not the case. In fact, at other demonstrations, instead of licking the stuff off his hand, he would drink the water in front of people. Now, had he swam down to the bottom of that probably 30-foot pit, he would have died most likely to the radiation, because he probably would have been boiled down there at that point. So there's a bit of a gimmick to what he's saying, but what he's trying to tell you is once you build a facility properly, we can get rid of this stuff without any headaches, okay? Now, interestingly, in the second part of this video, I'm just going to drop this in here because it was really strange, okay? Most of us who are of any age have seen videos of them burying these barrels out in the desert. And so they'll wedge down and dig out several feet, pour huge slates of concrete, which is a great insulator. Why? Because they don't want it to leak into the water mantle. Okay. And then they put these barrels in, and then they bury that in other layers of concrete. Again, just encapsulating this stuff. And they're telling you that, you're going to have to let it sit there for a very long time. Now, in the method that they're storing it, if they really did have this radioactive material in there, chemically, based on what we've learned before, or learned in the first part of this episode, the stuff has to be exposed to the oxygen to dissipate. So putting it in barrels doesn't do the job properly. But when he was asked whether or not any of this radioactive material was actually in these barrels, he said two things interesting. One, he said, no, those barrels don't have waste in them. It makes no sense. And then he was talking about something really, really strange. He said, well, that's where they bury the bodies. And I'm like, what? Like, what are we talking about all of a sudden here? You're talking about radioactive isotopes and radiation and lethality and emissions and all these other formulas. And all of a sudden you just said there's bodies in there? He goes, at one point it got so bad that the stench of the rotting flesh became a problem they had to deal with. He is no longer talking about anything related to what he's talking about in this presentation. He just drops a little bomb, which almost seems beyond his capacity to conceive because he's such a nice guy, that maybe there's some reason, there's some, industrial waste of human beings that need to be stored somewhere, and this is the clever way to do it. Now, for any of you who've been following, say, various threads over the last, let's just say, 6 years, your mind just started swimming like crazy, and I'm going to let you go there, because that's all I've got for this particular episode. There's no need to speculate beyond what he said. But if you want to see an interesting thing, fast forward to the point you see him sitting face-to-face with a gentleman in the hour and 31-minute video, and just listen to that part, and you'll hear him talk about it. Very interesting, right? A lot of kids were on milk cartons around that time, weren't there? Mm-hmm. Now, there are situations where obviously this is going to be a very lethal situation. Now, what I'm about to tell you is a story that I just recently heard from, was it Dark? It's Dark 9. I think it's from his other channel called Dark Footage, but it talks about the Demon Core. And I just had mentioned the Demon Core in a previous episode, but it is sort of very, very important in this episode. So obviously we know about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Now, imagine you're the U.S. Army. And it never dawned on me until I heard about the Demon Core that this would even be necessary. What if Japan didn't concede? What if they didn't concede? So we had a bunch of other cities that were planned to be attacked. Apparently, Tokyo had already been flattened pretty hard by bombings. Kyoto was actually on a reserve list because it was too historically important to bomb. I think that's actually decent. But a whole bunch of other cities were on this list that hadn't been destroyed yet that would be a big hit to the Japanese community. And so in order to make sure that there was a third bomb in play here, they created something called the Demon Core. So imagine you create a core that is 3.5 inches in diameter. Doesn't sound like much, but because it's made of the heaviest, most unstable material of, they called it, subcritical mass, but it's a plutonium core that weighed 14 pounds, okay? And then it was actually transported inside, I've seen the pictures of this, I would think about a 6-inch, maybe a little bit more outer case that was 2 different spheres. All right, so take a sphere that's probably, I guess, with the 3.5 inches, 6 on both sides, about 14 inches in diameter. Cut it in half, bore out the center so you can put this core in there. It's perfectly round. And then you can transport it, contained together, except there's one little thing you got to do. In order to make sure that the core doesn't go critical by being insulated with this lead exterior, from what I understand, you have to put spacers between the 2 hemispheres that are actually holding that core in place. That way, you allow some emissions to come out in an even distribution around the sphere, such that it's not lethal. Okay. So that core was being developed in order to create another gigantic bomb with very, very purified, I guess, highly critical at some point, plutonium. Now, how this thing would actually work is a little bit baffling because I guess that the encapsulation of it would get rid of that core and you start surrounding it with potentially a uranium ball and then, which is another horrible thing, and then a bunch of the explosives to compress it down. It never was used, thank God, but it killed 2 scientists. And it was 2 scientists that got very careless with this core, and I guess the way the story's told is that they were sort of hotshots in their industry and thought that they didn't need to follow the rules, let's just say. They were Top Gun Mavericks, of course, right? So the first guy, as I remember the story told, was using screwdrivers, the tips of screwdrivers around this core, the 2 halves, right, of the shielding core. And he screwed up and dropped one of the screwdrivers out, which collapsed the side that was facing away from him, thus taking all of this emissions, which immediately exponentially increase because it's no longer exhausting. And as soon as you don't exhaust a level of this emission, it starts to compound and it burst his stomach and he was dead within 35 days or so. Fast forward, A second guy does the exact same stupid mistake in a room with a bunch of people. The guys, both at his left and right, although they lived several decades, they did end up dying of cancer. So who knows, what that could be. It could be just smoking cigarettes and eating bad food. Who knows, right? I forgot the exact name of the isotope that was fed to the Russian guy that got poisoned. The spy that got poisoned several years ago. They said that if you got this stuff on your skin, as long as you cleaned yourself off, you could get a little sick or get an abrasion, some sort of necrosis of your cells at that point, because it emitted through your tissues and scrambled your DNA, scrambled all your cellular tissue. But this dude was most likely fed this through some sort of drink, and once you get it in your system, you'll have a problem very quickly. Now when Galen Winsor was eating this stuff off of his hand and telling one of his friends, who was, again, swallowing all of the sort of official news about the emission dangers from people that never asked the experts, the gentleman was, a friend of his, and he goes, man, you're nuts for drinking that. You're going to blow out your kidneys. He says, oh, am I? And he goes, I've been eating this stuff for a really long time. I guess I'm okay. He never died of a kidney problem, okay? I mean, if you get to 82, working in the radioactive industry, you did really well, trust me. But a lot of isotopes are off-put by iodine, which is a similar size particle that goes into your system and starts filling up all of the spaces in your body that if you happen to ingest some fallout in the form of dust, that it's going to basically try to go into the bone marrow, try to go into your thyroid, try to go to all these different places in your body, and the iodine will already be there. As if you've almost kind of smoothed out your insides with iodine. Now, iodine won't last forever, which is why you have to continue taking it on a particular regimen, and then it's going to have to be, most likely, your dosage is going to be proportionate to your body size. So I don't know that table personally, but I guarantee you a 4'5" child is going to have to take a lot less than a 6'5" daddy, and mommy's going to be somewhere in the middle, unless mama's on Amazon, right? And so just understand that. They say that when you do ingest this stuff, that even the official news is that a lot of these isotopes are so heavy, they do pass through your system, and some of them can go through your system very radioactive, and you'll be just fine when it passes out, while some of the more subtle isotopes can actually get stuck in there, which is why you need iodine if you're concerned about radioactive situations, or you think you might live in an area where people that are losing control of the world might use your city as fodder to create some chaotic event, right? The beautiful thing is that once you understand what a lot of these threats are, you suddenly get your mind back, you get your soul back, and you get this feeling of control back that you didn't have before. When you learn that there's not a single paper that connects HIV with this condition, this set of parameters, which they call AIDS. Well, it takes a lot of heat off you if you were to come up positive for HIV, okay? When you find out that drug use, cocaine, heroin, and whippets, meth is probably in there too. Anytime you're messing with the chemistry of your body with drugs, heavier the drug, the worse it is, you're blowing out your T cells. Well, when they debuted cocaine in the 80s, they needed some physical excuse why people were coming up with low T-cell counts. When they debuted heroin by the late 80s and it dominated the 90s, they had to explain why people are losing their T-cells. In the end, maybe they will go for total reduction in population by the people who use that stuff. In other cases, they might want to continue selling it because it creates liquid cash that's untraceable for organizations that need such things. I'll let you take a guess who those people might be. When you realize the thing that we've been dealing with for the last 2 years is heavily related to the ice gun that was created by an agency and debuted, I think, in a 1975 Senate hearing, which you can watch on YouTube. Just look up ice gun. And that it was using a shellfish venom to create a heart attack in the system, which wasn't traceable after a few hours. By the time the pathologist gets to your body, long gone, never find it, but you just had a heart attack, right? Well, we also know that venoms take away your taste, they give you acute respiratory breathing problems, and it clots your blood depending on which venom you get. So clotted, heart attacks, myocarditis, all that kind of stuff is related to venoms. So once you realize that, you're like, oh my gosh, I can fight it. Oh, and tobacco happens to disable venom on the brainstem. Interesting. Nicorette gum could get your breathing back. But if they lure you into another treatment that's going to completely modify your DNA and give you an immune deficiency problem, well, then they use excuse A to get you to take excuse B, or thing B, which will rock you and potentially kill you. And then if you happen to go into one of their institutions for medical care, they can just play God, give you a 9-day treatment, and you go out in a pine box. Once you figure out the life cycle of all that, you might get a little bit of your sanity back. You know what to avoid. You know what to do and what not to do. And the number one thing that you don't do is panic. That's a cool thing. And there's treatments that start with letter I that are extremely powerful for that. And there's treatments that start with H that are very powerful for that. Now, right now in the world, they're trying to get rid of nuclear power plants because they are extremely, extremely efficient. But why do they demonize them? Well, you had the Fukushima thing. And apparently you've got this idea that these cores actually are the big problem, right? Again, Chernobyl, unique situation, blew it into the air. Yes, there was a steam explosion, reactor 4. You saw that big, little mini nuke go off right there, right? It's exactly what they look like when you look at the suitcase bombs they've developed over the years. But there's an interesting thing that happened at Chernobyl. In Chernobyl, which was very, very real, their core melted into what is called the elephant foot. Why do they call it the elephant foot? Well, it's merely because of its appearance. But what it ended up doing, and this has happened at various facilities where it melts through pipes and it literally looks like Play-Doh that's frozen coming out of a pipe. This is condensed radioactive materials that are supposed to be in very specific shapes, kept within a certain proximity based on the shape and the size to create minor fission reaction to create this heat to boil turbines and make things happen. Okay. So this core melts down and it becomes one giant thing. I mean, it's humongous when you think about radioactive materials. Again, we haven't really seen the one in Fukushima, but that one's way down in the ground and self-insulates, right? This one is inside the building and it went down, broke through a wall because it just melts it, right? It melts the wall and it's stronger than anything that's getting in, gets in its way. And it goes down and it lays down on the ground, which creates this elephant foot sort of shape. It doesn't really look exactly like an elephant foot, but it's pretty good. Now, there's one shot of the elephant foot within the first week of trying to recover and get rid of all of the radioactive materials that blew up and got all on the rooftop, right? So you see those poor Russian guys wearing these lead shielding things on their chest, and they run up, and they're only allowed to do a couple shovels of this stuff. I think at one point, one of the rooftops had so much stuff on the roof that they're only allowed to climb up this ladder, put with the shielding on or put it on. They do one shovel scoop off the roof, and then they're down and they're out. And a bunch of those dudes died, apparently, of the radiation poisoning. Now, maybe they died, maybe they didn't. Why do I say that? Because when they discovered this elephant foot, because they did the trajectory of the core disappearing from the room it's supposed to be in, and they went, okay, it probably went down. They drove a robot, apparently. I've never seen the robot, but they drove it around a corner to film into a room. Now, what they said was that the robot got so many rads of radiation, okay, I don't know if that's the right unit, but it blew up the robot, but not before the robot snapped a very important shot, which I'm going to show you in the video. For those of you coming through podcasts, let me set up a shot for you in your brain. It's a cement room with a bunch of pipes everywhere. The elephant foot has broken through the wall on the right. So it's about an 8-foot thing, and it's just bubbly, weird, and it's metal, okay? And it's not moving anymore. So about 4 feet up is the elephant foot on the right, and then beyond the elephant foot, about 6 feet in, probably about 4 feet on the other side of this elephant foot, there's a dude on a terminal trying to shut some systems down or turn them on. He's in there typing on a terminal. Now, the robot gets so exposed to radiation, supposedly, that it short circuits. So much for just beta particles coming off of radiation, right? It's frying circuits by overloading it with an electron flow. Could be just dielectric flow, who knows? That guy lived a perfectly normal life after being caught in this photograph in a location where this elephant foot, theoretically speaking, with all of the restrictions that were put on Galen Winsor's team as of 1973, and made law as terms of lethal radiation by 1982, he would be dead. But he didn't die, and he doesn't suffer from any cancer that I know of. I think he's alive to this day, but that was a long time ago, 37 years ago. But I saw a documentary by a gentleman who worked there. And the guy was young. Whoever was on the monitor was young. So he had lots of decades left with a normal life, and he was still alive. They filmed the guy. Okay, so what gives? At some point, again, you have to be able to trust your eyeballs. Which is why I want to bring up another point, which I can't make a whole episode on, but it's a very important point, and it's a very small point. One of our listeners said to me, kind of a courageous statement in my opinion. They had watched recently my Did Dinosaurs Really Exist episode, which if you watch the episode, I think you'll come to the conclusion they did not. It's not a light-hearted accusation to get you to be, oh, screw you and watch it. No, it's a very serious exploration of paleontology, and you will come up with the same conclusion. I hate to repeat it again, but it's because I mentioned it in my last episode that they went and watched it. And they said to me, look, I have followed this other belief system my entire life. Well, for a long point in time, for several years, starting from today backwards, right? And in that belief system is lots of conversation about dinosaurs. I haven't gotten to that point in that research. But they're like, hey, if dinosaurs didn't exist, they wouldn't have written about it. So I'm actually holding true to the fact they did exist because this book says that they existed. If you think about it, there is something to that because you've got a system where you're being mailed, let's just say theoretically, a book that is telling you to believe something. And it's indoctrination. That's beautiful. It gets to come straight to you and you read it. And because other things might make sense to you, you adhere to this one and you won't let go, which means they got you. They got you with indoctrination. So we suffer from this all the time. And of course, when it comes to the lethality of radiation, it's something we don't really want to play games with, right? But just as the most astute scientists who practice their profession in these industries have documented in many articles, it is so specific to what you're trying to do, the materials that you're actually working with, the size and shape that you actually mold them into, and what you're trying to get out of these materials in terms of, do you want a weapon? Do you want a heating system? What are you looking for? You're looking for an energy source that might, again, power a satellite engine, okay? But if you get involved with these doctrines, it's hard to peel yourself away. But like I've told you, and I'll give you an example where this is a very similar situation. NASA has never been to the moon. They may never go to the moon, okay, without completely different platforms and technology. And again, if they do, they will have to reset society away from the current claim, meaning kill everybody off who's ever seen the current claims, because if they ever did get there, it wouldn't look the same way in their new photographs, right? It just won't. It just won't. It'll look different. Whether it be 10% different or 1% different, you're going to know that they finally went and it looks totally different. So they know a lot of us out there are actually chasing down those little factoids in the thousands when it comes to the moon missions. How did they get us, some of us, okay, to basically say immediately we did go? They go after people who are interested in UFOs. And so when you subscribe to UFOs, you're immediately saying, well, we definitely went to the moon, because the other backstory to the whole thing is that they found alien stuff on the moon. Immediately validating the invalidatable, which is the trip to the moon with 1969 technology, the fact that we've never gone back since 1972, that no country outside the United States has been able to pull it off. But again, if you talk to astrophysicist kids today, they'll tell you it's a piece of cake. And you're like, okay, kid, if it's a piece of cake, why haven't we gone? I mean, piece of cake also means the budget just went way, way down. It's because it's a lie. And these kids have been indoctrinated. So Galen, at one point, in his, I think it's the third segment, he wants to make sure that you understand that there is a threat by this material, which is good. He talks about the very simple threat of, say, depleted uranium. So depleted uranium, for those of you who have heard that a lot, but you're not quite sure what it is, they take out of uranium, which has a scale from, they want 234 and 235 out, and that means that when they've counted how many atomic pieces and parts make up a particular atom, they want the 4 and the 5 out, 234, 235 out, because that's the best stuff to make plutonium. Anything over that, anything under that, it goes all the way down to 222 and all the way up to 238. I mean, that's what I know of. I mean, it could go even further and go up further. That is no longer really useful for creating, at least with the current formulas, the plutonium that they want for bombs. So they made a ton of this stuff, like literally tons of this stuff. And now they have but it takes a lot more uranium to get these 34 and 35 out. So you imagine you had a carton of milk. It's 1 gallon carton of milk. But when you refine this down for the milk that you really want to drink, the good stuff that's in there, so it's non-pasteurized, of course, it's just a few tiny specks of the milk that you put on a little container. So it takes hundreds and hundreds of gallons just to make a tiny shot glass of milk. So what are you going to do with all this other milk you got there? What are you going to do with all this other uranium? Well, physics and physicists came together and said, well, we can make ammunition out of it. We can make armor out of it. Any of you, again, familiar with the A-10 Warthog, understand that there's a Gatling gun underneath the A-10 Warthog that shoots out 18-inch rounds that turn into, or maybe it's 14-inch rounds, that turn into molten uranium the second they go out the gun. And when it hits a tank, nothing's going to stop it because nothing's heavier than this round coming at the tank. It's pretty safe when it's non-molten, but it's also pretty safe when it's molten, except you can't hang on to it. You'd have to dry it out immediately because as soon as it crashes into something, you get what's called a metal gas. And it's just like a small little atom bomb going off. Even though it's not the really volatile stuff, it's still very lethal and it's just spreading that dust everywhere. But when it hits a tank, it penetrates the tank. And because there's so many rounds coming out of these A-10 Warthogs that they just literally cut the thing in half. Well, it starts hitting the ordnance inside the tank and explodes the tank. And that's usually a sort of a Desert Storm and up technique of getting rid of a tank. But Galen Winsor talked about something very interesting. He talked about guns that they had developed by 1985. It's very, very interesting. It seems like this guy, had he signed any NDAs, was definitely saying, I don't care about that. But he mentioned a technique of using these ordnance that I had never heard of before. And those of you in maybe armor divisions, you know. I don't know if they're using this at all, but they said they created a gun that was basically shooting a round through the tank. And without hitting the ordnance and making it explode, he says because this is so hot and so fast and it goes through the tank, he said that the heat that this creates going through the tank compartment, let's just say everybody gets back on the edge of the tank walls and this bullet goes between their heads. It doesn't actually impact anyone in particular. He says it vaporizes all the oxygen instantaneously, and because it's vaporizing the oxygen, you might think, well, they're dying of not being able to breathe. He says, well, it boils them inside the tank. And of course, you would be breathing probably multiple thousands of degrees oxygen, and that's what kills you in a fire, by the way. Well, the reason why the firemen tell you to get on your belly to crawl out of your house isn't because necessarily just smoke is your problem. Smoke inhalation will definitely kill you super fast, but the number one thing that'll kill you, if you say you look around your house like, I don't need to get down, I can totally see. Well, you might be able to pull that off, but you're going to want to hold your breath very quickly, okay, and not breathe until you get out of that house, because oxygen levels inside of a typical house fire can reach 850 degrees. It's a visible killer. And so you go breathing out the door. If you get one breath of anything over probably 300 to 400 degrees, the sacs in your lungs that process oxygen will get vaporized instantaneously. And even though you can muscularly get yourself outside, you'll never take another breath of oxygen in your life. And I'm not even sure what they would do to save your life at that point. You're going to have, you would have to fall into a unit that's going to give you oxygenated blood, like all the way through your body instantaneously. And they have to do a lung transplant in the next 10 minutes to get you back on track. So an atomic bomb is a threat because it vaporizes your body. It's just that simple. And that's just one stage of the bomb. What else happens during an atomic bomb? Well, it knocks stuff down. And if you're in the way of that stuff, you're not going to make it, you know? Part of a building falls on your head. I think what's interesting is, I think a lot of you watch like fail videos, right? Here at the lounge, we'll watch videos like that every once in a while. And it's sometimes the most subtle thing in the world that can take our lives, right? There's a lot of third world countries where I'll see construction sites where they're building a wall. They're just masons just throwing up bricks real fast. There's no safety protocols whatsoever. And the wall, sometimes it just happens because the wall is old, but someone's walking by a wall, they're behind a wall, and the wall just collapses and falls on somebody. Well, it just looks like a little cinder block wall, but when you add all the mortar and all the poundings and tonnage of those bricks, you're squished, you're gone. And so bombs are definitely something we need to be careful about. So in terms of the lethality, it is really the bomb itself. But again, just to repeat, according to the folks that I've read that were actually fairly critical of how Galen Winsor's material was being interpreted, most people who were very familiar with what he had said in 1985 were actually fairly gracious. They simply said he is being misinterpreted because he is a little vague in the specificity of what he's talking about, because he is talking about a very, very intense topic, and you want to be very specific when you give examples of what's what. But they said he's not trying to say that every single part of everything that's radioactive is just A-OK to ingest. But again, the most recent stuff that I had read today, I read all these articles today, they're basically saying that the radioactive nature of the bombs is actually very low if you can survive the actual explosion itself. Now again, you also have logistical things you have to think about: power, water, food supply. When those things are knocked out, it doesn't matter if it's anything's radioactive. They could just use a concussion bomb, and as long as those things get neutralized, you better have some stuff in your cupboard, right? But the other big question that Galen Winsor tries to get people to remember, and it was in a lot of the articles that I read that were analyzing his speech back in 85, was that he asked a very fundamental question. And this is going to be one of those questions where the answer is extremely obvious, and we're all going to roll our eyes when it comes to the control apparatus that would enforce the real answer. But Galen is famous for saying, who owns the plutonium? Who owns it? This stuff was manufactured, and of course these new agencies, as of 75 to 82, kept saying it's just, you don't want to be around this stuff. Now, we do have the Demon Core story, which is a very legitimate mishap on how this stuff was being transported. But according to Galen, had they not put this container around this core, they could have actually moved it around without the top on and just keep distance from it, make a bigger container around it, and of course the power of 10 away from the radiation. They could have probably dealt with it, but nobody wanted that inconvenience, right? But who owns the plutonium is a question to make you trigger your mind to go, yeah, wait a minute. The taxpayers of the United States of America, us, own the plutonium. So now imagine that your government creates a tax, okay, for this waste disposal. But they're the ones that created the waste in the first place. Remember what I asked you in my energy episode 7 years ago. I said to you, raise your hand if you picked coal plants. Raise your hand if you picked hydroelectric. Raise your hand if you picked nuclear power plants, solar panels, windmills. You never picked those things. Those things were imposed on you by your city, your state, or your government, and you had to pay for them. Now, with those situations outside of nuclear, you've got a situation where, okay, Coal is just going to create stuff we got to clean up in the scrubbers. Hydroelectric's clean as whatever. So it's been banned in the United States since 1973, coincidentally. Canada still does it. We're not allowed to do it. Meaning we can't build any new ones, right? We still have Hoover Dam, and I think, the energy company over by Niagara Falls. There's dams all over the place, but we're not allowed to make any new ones. It's clean, that's why. Well, we know that windmills are bullshit. We know that solar panels are bullshit. So imagine your country starts creating this material that then you have to pay a tremendous amount of money out of your GDP to dispose of. Simply because they're not willing to dispose of it in a way that is basically penniless, which is the way that Galen Winsor designed the reprocessing plant, the decommissioning plant in 1973. So he was watching billions of dollars being spent in the 80s to get rid of this stuff that's only cost nickels and dimes to get rid of. So he was like, what are you going to do? You own the plutonium. You own all of these plants. What's going on today, and I want to mention this every once in a while because I never hear this back. I have not heard one human being in the world ever say this back through some other video, which is the following. This new Green Deal that's out there is a way to intellectually guilt trip the world for decisions you never made. You never picked these forms of energy creation. If I had my choice, I'd work on Stan Meyer's engine. I'd go back and get the original Caltech design for a geothermal plant with no emissions coming out from the earth. Free energy. I mean, if we were going to make this a situation where we needed to pay for it, let's make the most priceless, penniless way of doing it. Galen Winsor was a good guy. He was a good guy. He was trying to do us a solid. He was trying to wake us up. I think it's just crazy, ironic that it was a video made 37 years ago. It's been going around for several years, of course, but it was YouTube of all places. But the video gets reposted. I definitely run into dead links where they say, they talk about, one website transcribed his whole speech, which was really cool. I just found it like 5 minutes before I had to come and do this video. I would have loved to have had that, but it takes a lot of reprocessing the information for you guys. But there's certain accounts that have reposted it and it's dead. It's definitely out there. I'll put it in the description, at least one that'll hopefully work for a little while. Maybe I'll use the Rumble platform to make sure it sticks there. The cool thing about my question to you about who chose all this stuff and, the industry guilt tripping us to buy them a new platform of energy. Let's just say they find out a way to make energy out of oranges. Nothing special. Stick a couple solenoids in there and it's just 100% makes all the energy for the world. They want us to buy them all the oranges, buy them all the wires. We give it to them and then they'll charge us money for something that we paid for. Your tax dollars paid for all those nuclear power plants all around the planet. Those aren't just built out of some Rockefeller back pocket. Maybe there's some private, Edison and PG&E that build their own power plants. Okay. But as long as we can build it ourselves and it's safe and it's clean, that's what we should be doing. And that's what Galen Winsor was trying to get us to understand. And he was also trying to say, look, this isn't bomb material. We're not blowing it up and throwing it into the sky. We have complete and utter control over the fuels that we create using these materials inside nuclear power plants. We can take the water and get rid of it fairly pennilessly, and we can take the rods once they're completely spent and get rid of them easily. Not completely free, but considering what it costs today to do it, it's free. In fact, it's a profit system at this point, considering how much money we spend on this right now. Meaning the money we get back, we could pay for kids' educations, Anyway, that is the story of Galen Winsor, and that is a new sort of take on sort of what is dangerous, what isn't dangerous. There's a lot less we have to worry about when it comes to the after effects of these situations, unless someone tries to create a super lethal stuff that would be spread by the bomb itself. But just remember, the people who control the planet, they don't really want the world to be uninhabitable ever. Ever, ever, ever. Because As soon as they get rid of us, they're going to want to live there. And so they don't want to have anything that takes people to clean up, because there won't be any people to clean it up, right? So as much as you might hear those threats, probably not the case. Now again, the narrative's being built for these things to be used for the first time since 1945. Definitely be careful with your comments online to exacerbate that war. There's a bunch of kids right now. This is actually sort of ironically, morbidly hilarious. We have a bunch of kids right now that are championing this war that's over there near Russia, right? They're saying, do it, do it, do it, take it all back, and they're going to get a draft card. And it's going to be hysterical when all of a sudden they get put over there and, they're completely out of shape. Basic training couldn't do much for them, and they're just liquidated over there. Or they're standing next to one of these balls of fire that fall out of the sky. So, again, we want to be very careful about how we wish for satanic rituals in our life, because we'll get them. So, take all that to heart. If you haven't been to deepthoughtsradio.com, please go. It's got everything you need. Video, audio, all social media. All new remastered season 1 on YouTube, but Rumble, BitChute's got it all. Odyssey has it all. So maybe screw that. Just go to the other platforms. This whole channel is being mirrored over to Rumble, and then that's what the site uses for all of its video pleasures. But we're backed up on other channels. Just in case one of them happens to fizzle out, we're going to have backup. We also have a store with some cool shirts. And for those of you who support me through PayPal and Patreon, thank you so much. Huge shout out to Timothy Smith, who sent me a contribution through PayPal. Thank you so much. Super duper appreciate it. Hopefully I'm earning my paycheck. All my Patreons, thank you so much. You make it happen. Take care of yourself and someone else, and I'll see you in the next Deep Thoughts. Over and out.